Could a life, meticulously swept clean of joy, ever truly bloom again? Lin Meifeng, at 68, often pondered this as she surveyed her small Shanghai apartment. 7 years. 7 years since Chen Wei, her husband of 35 years, had walked out, his parting words a casual dismissal that had shattered her world more completely than any shouting match could have. He had left not for another woman his age, but for one of his postgraduate students, a girl barely older than their son, Xiaobo. The scandal had been a quiet academic affair, but its tremors had fundamentally altered Meifeng's landscape, leaving her stranded on an island of polite condolences and averted gazes. Her apartment in the older, rapidly gentrifying Jing'an district was her fortress. Sunlight, when it deigned to filter through Shanghai's perpetual haze, touched upon old wooden furniture, polished not with enthusiasm, but with habit. A single, celadon teacup sat on the small table by her armchair, a testament to her solitary rituals. On the balcony, pots of jasmine fought for life, their fragrance a faint, sweet ghost in the city air. Among them, an orchid, a gift from Xiaobo years ago, stubbornly refused to bloom, its leaves a dull, listless green, a mirror, Meifeng often thought, to her own existence. Her days were a metronome of quiet routines, oolong tea at dawn, a chapter of Tang poetry, a slow walk to the wet market if the air wasn't too thick, simple meals eaten alone with the television murmuring unheard. Her hands, elegant and slender, were often clasped tightly in her lap, a small unconscious betrayal of the anxiety that hummed beneath her composed surface. This particular morning, the usual city symphony, the distant roar of traffic, the clatter of mahjong tiles from a neighbour's window, the faint cry of a street food vendor, was punctuated by a series of insistent knocks. It was Mrs. Liu from 3B, her face wreathed in a determined smile. "Meifeng Jie, good morning. The community centre is having a senior health talk and a little social afterwards. You should come." Meifeng's smile was polite, a carefully constructed defence. "Ah, Liu Tai, thank you for thinking of me, but I have things to do today." The things were usually just the silent company of her books and the endless task of keeping her small space immaculate. Mrs. Liu, a woman whose well-meaning inquisitiveness was legendary in their building, was not easily deterred. "Nonsense. What things? A little fresh air, a bit of company. It will do you good. Old friends, new faces. Come now, I won't take no for an answer." Meifeng felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the desire to retreat. Social interaction, once a source of pleasure when Chen Wei had been a rising star in the university and she his graceful, supportive wife, now felt like navigating a minefield. Every polite inquiry seemed to hide a barb, every shared glance a judgment. Chen Wei had been thorough in his campaign of quiet character assassination before he left, painting her as difficult, cold, unsupportive, a narrative that had conveniently paved the way for his departure with his young protégé. Yet something in Mrs. Liu's persistent cheerfulness, or perhaps a flicker of her own deeply buried loneliness, made Meifeng hesitate. Well, perhaps just for a little while. She conceded, more to appease her neighbour than from any genuine interest. A sense of dread, cold and familiar, settled in her stomach. The community centre buzzed with a forced conviviality that Meifeng found exhausting. Elderly men and women sat on plastic chairs listening to a doctor drone on about blood pressure. Meifeng found a seat near the back, already planning her escape. Afterwards, during the social part, which involved weak tea and stale biscuits, Mrs. Liu, beaming, steered her towards a small group. "Meifeng Jie, this is Mr. Gao Jiqiang," Mrs. Liu announced. "Mr. Gao, this is Mrs. Lin Meifeng from my building." Gao Jiqiang was a man perhaps a few years older than her, with a kind, weathered face and intelligent eyes that held a quiet sadness. He inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Lin, a pleasure." His voice was calm, steady. "Mr. Gao," Meifeng murmured, her gaze dropping to her teacup. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by Mrs. Liu's enthusiastic interjections. Meifeng learned he was a retired engineer, a widower. Then, a casual remark from him sent a jolt of alarm through her. "Professor Chen Wei from Fudan University?" he'd asked, his brow furrowed in thought when Meifeng had, prompted by Mrs. Liu, mentioned her late husband's profession without naming him. "I believe I knew of him, peripherally. My late wife was also in academia, a distant colleague. Small world." Meifeng's blood ran cold. Knew of him. What did that mean? What had he heard? The carefully constructed wall around her heart seemed to crack. She mumbled a polite excuse and, despite Mrs. Liu's protests, made her escape, the stale air of the community centre suddenly feeling suffocating. Over the next few weeks, however, escape proved difficult. Shanghai, for all its vastness, could feel like a village. She encountered Gao Jiqiang at the local park, where she sometimes walked, his pace unhurried, his presence unobtrusive. Another time, Mrs. Liu had insisted Mei Feng join her for tea at a small traditional tea house, and Mr. Gao had, by coincidence, been there too. He never pressed, never pried. He spoke of his late wife with a gentle sorrow, of his grown children living in other cities, of his fondness for erhu music. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were thoughtful. Mei Feng found herself, to her own astonishment, experiencing small, unfamiliar flickers of warmth. A shared smile over a particularly noisy group of Tai Chi practitioners, a comfortable silence as they watched children chase pigeons. These moments were tiny embers, quickly doused by the cold water of her fear. Flashbacks, sharp and unwelcome, ambushed her at odd moments. Chen Wei's voice, smooth and condescending. "You're too sensitive, Mei Feng, it's just a bit of academic rivalry." Or, "No one understands my work, my pressures, like she does." Referring to the student who would eventually replace her. He had been so adept at twisting reality, at making her doubt her own perceptions. He had cultivated an image of himself as a brilliant, beleaguered intellectual, burdened by an emotionally demanding wife. The shame of it, the public nature of her private failure, still burned. How could she trust anyone again, especially someone who had moved in Chen Wei's orbit, however distantly? One afternoon, as they walked along the tree-lined paths of Fuxing Park, the late autumn sun casting long shadows, Jiqiang broke a comfortable silence. He had sensed her continued reserve, the invisible shield she kept raised. "Mrs. Lin, Mei Feng," he began, his voice gentle. "May I be frank?" Mei Feng's heart gave a nervous flutter. She merely nodded, her gaze fixed on a fallen ginkgo leaf. "When I mentioned knowing of Professor Chen Wei," he continued, choosing his words with care, I should have been clearer. My late wife, Xu Zhen, she sometimes spoke of him. He was well regarded in his field, and sometimes she would mention that he had a somewhat difficult home life, that his wife was perhaps not always supportive of his ambitions. Mei Feng stopped walking. The world seemed to tilt. The air grew thin. This was it. The judgment she had always feared, delivered so softly, so kindly. Jiqiang's expression was pained. "Please understand," he went on, his voice earnest, "these were just whispers. Second-hand accounts, likely coloured by Professor Chen's own narrative. I never met this wife. I never gave it much thought at the time. But now, getting to know you, Mei Feng, the person I see, the kindness, the quiet strength, it bears no resemblance to those old faded impressions, and I find myself deeply regretting ever having harboured such a thoughtless, second-hand prejudice, however vague." Humiliation, hot and swift, washed over Mei Feng. It was one thing to know Chen Wei had slandered her. It was another to have it confirmed that the poison had spread, that this kind man before her had once, however briefly, viewed her through that tainted lens. She felt stripped bare, the carefully constructed facade of dignified solitude crumbling. "I must go," she stammered, turning abruptly, tears stinging her eyes. She fled, leaving Gao Jiqiang standing alone under the golden ginkgo trees, his face etched with concern. For several days, Mei Feng retreated into her shell. She didn't answer Mrs. Liu's calls. The apartment felt smaller, the silence heavier. The struggling orchid on her balcony seemed to mock her. Difficult, unsupportive. Chen Wei's words, echoed indirectly by Jiqiang, resonated in her mind. Was that how the world saw her? Was that all she was? Her son, Xiaobo, noticed the change during his weekly duty call. He was a busy professional, his life in Pudong a world away from her quiet Jing'an existence. He loved his mother, in his own pragmatic way, but his empathy often fell short of her deeper emotional needs. "Ma, are you all right? You sound down," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the phone. "You haven't been going out much, have you? Mrs. Liu mentioned you missed the last community gathering." Mei Feng deflected. "Just a little tired, Xiaobo. Nothing to worry about." "Are you sure it's not that, Mr. Gao?" Xiaobo pressed, a hint of suspicion in his tone. He had met Jiqiang briefly once when picking Mei Feng up. "Ma, you have to be careful. At your age, people can be taken advantage of, and frankly, it might seem a bit unseemly." What will people say?
Yes.
Face, the ever-present concern. Chen Wei had stolen hers years ago, and now even her own son seemed more worried about appearances than her well-being. The familiar ache of loneliness deepened. A few days later, a small, hand-delivered note appeared under her door. It was from Ji Qiang. No excuses, no pressure, just a simple, respectful inquiry about her well-being and a reiteration of his sincere respect for her, the Mei Feng he was coming to know, not some ghost from a misremembered past. He wrote of his own loneliness after Xu Zhen's passing, the quiet ache of an empty home. Mrs. Liu, too, managed to catch Mei Feng at her door, offering a thermos of her favourite Longjing tea and a piece of osmanthus cake. "Don't let old hurts close you off to new sunshine, Mei Feng Jie," she said softly, her usual boisterousness subdued. "Mr. Gao is a good man, a lonely man." Mei Feng sat with Ji Qiang's note and Mrs. Liu's tea. The orchid still drooped, but somewhere deep inside, a tiny, stubborn shoot of courage began to unfurl. Was she to live out her remaining years imprisoned by Chen Wei's narrative? Was fear to be her only companion? With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. "Mr. Gao," she said when he answered, her voice barely a whisper. Perhaps we could have tea." The climax arrived not with a bang, but with Xiaobo's well-intentioned but clumsy concern. He had heard snippets of neighbourhood gossip, perhaps, or his own anxieties about his mother's vulnerability had festered. He appeared at her apartment one Saturday afternoon, his brow furrowed, his demeanour that of a man on a difficult mission. "Ma," he began after refusing tea, "we need to talk about this Mr. Gao." Mei Feng braced herself. "What about him, Xiaobo? I've been thinking, and I've heard things." He hesitated, then plunged. "You know, after Baba left, he told me some things. About why. He said you were very demanding, Ma, that you made life difficult for him, that he had no choice." The words, though echoing Chen Wei's familiar script, struck Mei Feng with fresh pain coming from her son. Had Xiaobo carried this poisoned view of her all these years? He said he was trying to protect his career, his peace of mind. Xiaobo continued, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "And now, this Mr. Gao, are you sure of his intentions? Is it wise? What if you get hurt again? What if he's just after your pension, your apartment?" The accusation, so base, so unlike the gentleman she was coming to know, was the final straw. Something snapped within Lin Mei Feng. Years of suppressed pain, of swallowed pride, of silent endurance erupted. She rose from her chair, her small frame radiating an unexpected power. Her hands, usually clasped, were now fisted at her sides. "Your father," she said, her voice low and trembling with a controlled fury Xiaobo had never witnessed, "was a master manipulator. He spent years crafting a narrative of my inadequacy to excuse his own selfishness, his own betrayal. He told you I was demanding. He demanded my silence, my complicity in his public facade while he sought understanding elsewhere. He told you I made life difficult. He systematically dismantled my confidence, my friendships, my very sense of self, until he could walk away looking like a martyr." Tears streamed down her face, unchecked. "For 7 years, Xiaobo, I have lived with the ghosts he created. I have lived with the whispers, the pitying looks, the shame he so expertly manufactured and draped over me. I have been silent. I have been dignified." Her voice broke on the word. "But no more," she declared, her voice rising. "I will not let his lies dictate the rest of my life. I will not let fear of what people will say keep me locked in this lonely prison. Mr. Gao Qichang sees me, Xiaobo. He sees Lin Mei Feng, not the caricature your father painted for his convenience. He is a kind, honourable man who has also known loss and loneliness. And if I choose to find a measure of companionship, a moment of warmth in the autumn of my life with him, then that is my right, my decision." She stood before her son, breathing heavily, the torrent of words leaving her spent but strangely lightened. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by her ragged breaths. Xiaobo stared at his mother, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. He had never seen her like this, never heard such raw, unfiltered pain. The carefully composed, quietly suffering mother he thought he knew had vanished, replaced by this fierce, wounded woman who was finally, unequivocally fighting for herself. Much of what she said, the depth of Chen Wei's calculated cruelty, was a revelation. He had only ever heard his father's carefully curated side of the story, designed to elicit sympathy and absolve him of blame. Shame washed over him. Shame for his easy acceptance of his father's narrative, shame for his own superficial concerns about face and propriety, shame for not seeing, truly seeing, his mother's suffering. "Ma," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Ma, I didn't know. I'm so sorry, I never understood." He reached out a tentative hand, then let it drop, unsure. "I was wrong." The anger drained from Meifeng, leaving a vast, aching weariness, but also a sliver of peace. She sank back into her chair. "He was very convincing," she said quietly, not as an excuse for Xiaobo, but as a simple statement of fact. Xiaobo knelt by her chair, his usual professional composure gone. If Mr. Gao makes you happy, Ma, then that's what matters." It was awkward, hesitant, but it was a start. A bridge, fragile but present, began to form across the chasm of misunderstanding. In the weeks that followed, a quiet transformation took place. Meifeng and Jiqiang's companionship deepened, nurtured by the honesty that had been forced into the open. There was no talk of a grand wedding. Such a display would have felt alien to them both. Instead, there was a simple, unspoken commitment to share the paths that remained. Jiqiang became a regular visitor to Meifeng's apartment. Sometimes he would bring his erhu, and its melancholic, sweet strains would fill the small rooms, chasing away the lingering shadows. Meifeng, in turn, rediscovered her old calligraphy set, her brushstrokes regaining a fluidity she thought lost. They shared simple meals, took slow walks, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes discussing a news article, a poem, or a memory, carefully navigating the past, but always returning to the gentle present. Xiaobo called more often, his tone warmer, more genuinely interested in her well-being, her happiness. He even one Sunday brought his wife and young daughter for a visit, and the apartment, for a few hours, echoed with a new kind of life.